Thank you for the introduction, Bernd. So I spent the last 6 hours converting my slides to German, and now I'm speaking English, but no worries. If you have any questions regarding what's on the slides, just ask. So I'd like to give you an overview, just something like in a nutshell, what's going on in current trends in television and TV in regards to like the technical formats, like spatial resolution, more sharpness, higher dynamic range, deeper blacks and brighter whites, color gamut, and also motion. So like more fluid portrayal of motion. So let's start with spatial resolution. So what's the motivation to distribute images and to acquire images in higher resolution? Actually, the motivation is that screens get larger. So that's at least the theory. And looking at these TVs seems to be quite valid. But when we actually look at the standards, and for example, the NHK is planning to distribute in 8,000 pixels of horizontal resolution from 2021 on. And you look at these graphs, does this kind of depict the situation in your cinema? In your living room? I would say it's pretty much how my wife and I watch movies. Maybe our television is a little bit smaller. Is this cinema? Maybe, yeah. But what are these guys planning here? If this is the scale of a person, this is something like 10 meters vertical. What is my landlord telling me if I say we have to extend our living room? Don't really understand. And actually, interestingly, there were some studies in the 2000s about what resolution do you need in cinema. And in reality, if you're going beyond 4K resolution, only the first few rows can even see a difference. And typically in a cinema, in the first or second row, would you sit in the first or second row? You won't. Oh, okay. So you like it to have a wide field of view. Got it. Yeah. Actually, I'm also often sitting like in the third row or so, because that's, for me, cinema is something about really being into the image. And also the BBC did a study, and they found out that only 10% of the current viewers are even see a difference between full HD and HD-ready resolution. And for going to UHD, it's only 1.5% in the UK. So actually one of my friends, the technical director of ZDF, for this reason said, I cannot really justify to go to UHD and spend taxpayers' money. Okay, he calls it Beihilfen and not Steuern, but anyway, it's about the same, for giving 1.5% of the viewers a better experience. So you may know that the new broadcasting specs, for example, from ZDF, still, even if they require high dynamic range, we'll talk about that later, still allow you to deliver in standard HD resolution. So you don't have to go 4K for ZDF, opposed to Netflix and others. Okay, so is higher resolution really a bad idea? Is there no benefit on it? Actually, there is one example that I really liked, and this is this landscape with snow. What do I want to tell you with that? I've seen these are Alexa 65 images, and when I saw them on a standard dynamic range, classic, or on a 4K monitor, I was like, not really impressed. But then I saw them together with high dynamic range, and suddenly all this extra resolution going from 2,000 pixels to 4,000 makes sense, because all these small sparkles on the snow, they looked so amazing when you had more dynamic range. So let's talk about more dynamic range now that we're finished with higher resolution. What is high dynamic range? Why do we need high dynamic range? So this is a scale of typical luminance in the real world. It goes from 0.001 to 10,000 candela per square meter. What is a candela per square meter? This is kind of the scientific unit for luminance. And you can imagine if you have one standard candle 1 meter away from a white piece of paper, then the luminance you have on this white piece of paper is 1 candela. So if you're like, have this candlelight dinner with 3 candles, and you have a white tablecloth, and the white tablecloth is 1 meter away from the candles, then the tablecloth will have 3 candela per square meter. So this is typically for kind of darkish environments. The dynamic range of human vision, or let's say the steady state dynamic range, so like the dynamic range of our retina is about 13 stops. But the cool thing about our human vision is we can adapt. So, and actually the steady state dynamic range of 13 steps was measured for 1/10 of a second. So even within a second, we can adapt from like very dark images to brighter images. A typical cinema has a white value of 48 nits and a black value of 1,000th of this, so something around 0.05 nit. So you see that the cinema lacks some dynamic range compared to human vision. We can see brighter, or also if we go back here, we can also see darker than a typical cinema or a standard dynamic range TV. So this is the idea of high dynamic range. For example, in Dolby Cinema, presenting much darker blacks, or on these LED screens. Who of you visited the Essling Samsung Onyx screen? You guys did? Did you like it?
It was too bright. I had to be a little bit used to it. So
yeah.
First impression. The second one was better.
Yeah. Yeah, for me it's also like I still need to adapt to that. Interestingly, so I was there with their opening and we were like rehearsing the talks, and then they tried around and played with the content, and at first they were going like 2/3 up the scale what this screen could do. And we looked at it and we said, it kind of looks amazing, but it's not cinema anymore. So to not scare the media, they turned it down to being about something like 100 nits. So like 1 stop brighter than typical cinema, but very, very far away from the 500 nits that they could do. It also, like for me, it doesn't feel like cinema, it feels different. And probably you have, or my experience with also HDR when I was in the US, I spent weeks and weeks just sitting 2 or 3 hours in front of the HDR TV and just exposing myself to these images to kind of get a viewing experience in this. And at some point, I really started to like very bright images on a TV. But in cinema, I'm still, personally not really convinced. But anyway, so the idea of HDR is having much blacker blacks and brighter whites. We can discuss later when we are grabbing a beer if that helps with storytelling, because that's a completely different thing. But that's what HDR is about. Some of the technical problems is actually stray light or flare, that typically in the cinema you have emergency exit signs, or you don't want to paint your living room with black paint. My wife doesn't want, but I also don't want it. But especially the beauty of HDR lies on the one hand in these blacks. That's why I put the Revenant here, because if you've ever seen in Dolby Cinema or on these Samsung or Sony screens, the Revenant, the dark scenes, it's amazing. You can see such subtle details in the blacks. And on the other hand, it's the real bright things that sometimes really can add to storytelling, especially if they're saturated. So now coming from high dynamic range to wide gamut, because this lightsaber is a very saturated color. Let's talk about the third thing. We talked about spatial resolution, about sharpness. We talked about high dynamic range, and now we're talking about wide gamut, saturated colors. So what is wide color gamut? So this is the typical plot you're exposed to if we're talking about colors. You see desaturated colors in the middle here, the full luminance scale. You could think of it being like vertical to the screen. And then the closer you get to the spectral locus here, the more saturated the colors are. A typical TV set that you bought a couple of years ago could display a standard that is called Rec 709. What is the kind of colors that can be reproduced with 709? Most of the object colors, so most of the colors that a reflecting object can have, except for in the reds. So for example, when I visited Pixar, they told me that with cars, they had a real big problem. They were mastering in a color space called DCI-P3, which is nowadays a standard for TV, but also like all Apple devices have P3 color space. They had a real challenge to get a convincing red, kind of Ferrari red, to reproduce this in 709. And it took a lot of work in color grading and adjusting other colors for a color contrast to kind of storytell a really convincing red. So there are cases where you're limited with by GAMUT. Actually, having P3 GAMUT, it covers 99% of the object colors. So what lies beyond P3 is typically stuff like super saturated LED lights or fluorescence. Fluorescence is something that can be super saturated. So the question is it really worth going beyond P3? Anyway, it's a trend. And in my personal experience, so this is one of the things that I did during my PhD. In the industry, it's called the Stuttgart dataset. Wherever I came, everybody was who works in like display industry or camera knew this dataset because it was actually the first high dynamic range dataset that was had a cinematic quality to it. And in this dataset, we played a lot with saturated colors, and we tried to explicitly find out, is it worth going beyond P3? So we graded colors to be exactly out of P3, but still inside Rec 2020. And it was really, really tough to get a benefit from going beyond P3 color space. The only exception was some of these magic or these things like fluorescent, and think of like these small things that were flying in the air in Avatar. If you have these blues in fluorescent, that can really or could help to the magic, but it was quite rare cases. And also one of our colleagues is working on how to guide the view through white color gamut. For example, she graded like a field of flowers, and then you have a few flowers that go beyond standard or beyond standard object colors. And in a lot of cases, you don't even notice that they go there, but if you use eye tracking, you can prove that it focuses the attention. So that might be something, but it's still research, and we're still working on it. So what you also see is for our data set, we did a lot of demos and discussions with creatives, but also technicians. Is it really worth? Is it worth going to high dynamic range? Is it worth going to changing the system? And interestingly, the first thing that most creatives said, wow, this is super amazing. I love the vividness of the colors, and I love the contrast and everything. But then the second thing they said is, why does this stuff stutter so horribly? And to explain this, why high dynamic range stutters more, I prepared a very, very simple demo. If you look at this square, this stutters to me, but the dark one, okay, it's not playing back super fluently, but still, it's not as disturbing. The contrast is always 1 to 10. So here you have 10 candela per square meter on a 100 on a 10. This is 1 candela on a 0.1 candela background. This is 10 on a 1. So the contrast stays the same. It's always 10 times brighter, the box, than the background, if the screen is calibrated correctly. But with luminance going up, the stuttering is really, really disturbing. And I can't show you HDR here, but in HDR it gets really, it gets amplified a lot. So do we have to go to higher frame rates? I think we tried it, and the reception of the audience was kind of very, very mixed. So they called it the soap opera effect, or I do not know many DOPs who really liked it. Actually, none, honestly. So, but the challenge is that a lot of creatives, they are really excited about high dynamic range and wide color gamut, but they prefer the 24p, the cinema look. But you can't really combine, you can't tell a story, and stories are often about motion, not only in action movies. You can't use it together because it stutters so much. So this is really one of the, for me, super exciting challenges that we are working on and that we want to work on in the future. How can we preserve the film look, like the motion film look, but still don't have this disturbing stuttering? And yeah, I hope that in a couple of years I can present you more on that. But actually the idea of this talk was more to put the emphasis on what is currently going on in the industry, and also what are the challenges and what do we have to work on. So the conclusion is actually going to higher resolution. In what resolution are we recording this? HD, okay, makes sense. You don't want to see my wrinkles and everything in detail. So the difference between HD and UHD, or 2K and 4K, sometimes can help to material appearance, like in the snow example, but it is not the major thing to get someone to buy a new TV or go to cinema, because it's such an overwhelming experience. High dynamic range is, a lot of creative people really like it. But on the other hand, what is interesting is some aspect that we noticed, and we haven't quantified it yet, but somehow you can get more immersion by making the images look more real. But on the other hand, it can hurt you in storytelling. Because somehow for storytelling you need some kind of abstraction. And a lot of DOPs like putting grain on the images, or using some layer of abstraction to tell you this is not reality. I don't want to go to a war movie where people are like dying in the image and feel like I'm really into it, but you need some layer of abstraction. And that's why I love the images when I'm looking at the images, but I'm still not 100% sure if HDR is really the right tool for storytelling. Netflix and the other streaming providers will tell you something different. Some creatives love it, but I've also experienced friends that said, Jan, if you go to cinema, go to the SDR version. Don't look at it in HDR cinema or on your HDR TV. I prefer the standard grade version. So it's still very mixed in the creative community. Could be that they are just conservative, or maybe actually it's easier to tell stories if you have this layer of abstraction, and if the screen is kind of a canvas. A canvas in a painting also doesn't have high dynamic range and everything. Still, there are billions of amazing paintings in the world. Wide color gamut is actually, especially for these magic objects, the easiest, because it doesn't kind of change. For a lot of DOPs that I showed HDR and wide color gamut, when I just gave them a little bit deeper blacks and white color gamut, they said that's how I always wanted film to look like. Like, as soon as we increased also brightness, or let them increase brightness in grading, they said it's amazing, material appearance and everything, but that's not film anymore. So that is really interesting in my point of view to do research on. White kind of feels like reality, but not for some, not like a good tool for storytelling. Yeah, and higher frame rate is really, for me, the research challenge in this area, because we need it, but nobody likes it, and that's why I find it exciting, because if we want, for example, high dynamic range or wide color gamut, we have to work on higher frame rates. And there are interesting works, especially from Saarbrücken, who try to, for example, only have the highlights in higher frame rate, but preserve the 24 look in the rest of the image. And there are lots of exciting works, but let's talk about that during the beer.
Thank you, Jan, for this very interesting talk. Don't run away. Don't run away. Don't run away. Maybe there is a question or two.
What about the South Asian consumers, like South Korea and Japan? Because they are known for being early adopters of technology and looks. Did you encounter on your research difference in perception, cultural differences?
Very interesting question. So what is kind of proven is that in most countries of Asia, colder images are preferred. Like in Europe and the US, most of the cinema movies were still graded very, very warm, even in the digital age, where you can select your white point. But in most Asian countries, there is a preference also for like colder skin tones, and that goes with like the illumination and so on. I have not read scientific evidence for like HDR being preferred there or highest resolution, but actually most of these trends come from South Korea or Japan. That's why we can assume that there is some preference for that. But it's a very good question. Also, like I feel we distributed at one of my first employers, we distributed also some Asian movies, and I felt that this look that we could call video look was much more common. When digital cameras came along, kind of a lot of Asian countries just embraced the look of the digital camera. And my customers here, they always wanted me to include some weave, that the images moves, and some film grain, and simulate the look of film, and said this is important for storytelling. But the digital cinema packages or masters that we got from Asia often had a very, very clean look, and they kind of more embraced like the digital look. And I find that this is still the case today. So half a year ago, I was still working at ARI, and I was mostly in research and development, but I was also sometimes in the servicing department. And most of the films that I saw were like really trying to emulate film, analog film.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that overview. I want to connect to what you said about The Hobbit. I saw the movie in higher frame rate. I think that I was distracted in a way. I think the stereo was great in higher frame rate. Though I'm still wondering when you say it doesn't look like cinema. I think I know what you mean, this unexpected crispness and something that's more related to maybe TV, but I wonder if that's not just the eve of a change in viewing habits, that, you know, if there is so much reality and crispness in the image that it's a question of the right content and telling a story that way, that people will start welcoming this and saying like, yes, this looks like new TV, or there's a certain style of old film look, which is, it's more related to analog technology than to digital technology.
I also absolutely agree. For me, this was, I feel that we still have to learn a lot, like in staging and in all the preparing the props, because for me it often looks like, for example, the outdoor scenes, they shot it in the Gartenbauabteilung at Hagebaumarkt. It was really, it was like, but a little bit it's maybe like when we changed from standard definition to high definition, there was a big problem in makeup. And then there were these seminars just teaching people or trying to learn how to do makeup for high definition. And it was a challenge for us as an industry to make or to tell the story with the images, or create images that help tell the story in HD. And I had the same in 4K. When we did tests with a Sony f65 for the first time, we had real-time a model in a cinema, and we just transmitted these images, and it was a beautiful model. And we went to the cinema, and we had her face on 7 meters. And we saw some like the blue veins going through the image and so on, because she had a little bit of transparent skin. And we thought, well, she looks like she's a drug addict. But it was just because we were amplifying so much and everything was shown, and then we in this workshop we learned to put on more makeup and also to be even more careful in 4K with the makeup. And so, yeah, I'm really super excited, and I have no idea if in 10 years we will still be like in a very analog film style look in most films, or if everything's still converted, or if we're completely used to seeing movies in high dynamic range and so on.
Isn't there a new high frame rate, high dynamic range film from Ang Lee as well coming out? I think there was an announcement at IBC 2 years ago or something.
So he's working on, he had Billy Lynn's Halftime Walk, and he's working on something new. But I actually don't even know if it was released, because even Billy Lynn I couldn't see, because it was only shown in 120 frames in New York in one cinema. And I didn't attend the one IBC where they just for this one built the full technical cinema just for this one screening. So.
Yes, another question?
Talking about high frame rate, the problem with the crispness often comes from not having any motion blur anymore, or only very small. And in animation film, it would be easy to have the same range of motion blur, but in live action movie, the problem is that you could basically like average 3 neighboring frames together and have motion blur back. Yeah. But camera shutters only open for half the frame time at maximum, as far as I know.
No, actually you can.
Do you know if it's
we are just releasing a data set that was shot in 192 frames per second, and it was shot with nearly 360-degree shutter.
Okay.
So it has, you call it dead time or Totzeit, so the sensor has some short time, but even if you render motion blur, you don't see, only if it's like a very, very small bright spot, then you see a line, and then a very, very short black, like 1 pixel missing, and then again, but it is over 350 degree is like the integration time, and we render different synthetic shutter versions of that. Actually, we just published at Hollywood Post Alliance in Palm Springs a paper where we tried really hard with synthetic shutter to stick with 24 frames in HDR, and we didn't succeed. You can render like a really weird, super long shutter. Every motion gets soft, like you're it doesn't feel, it's really completely weird, but still it stuttered. So the only way, or the result of this paper was that we found out you have to go higher frame rate. So now the next project that we work on is we go higher frame rate, but how can we still have the 24 look? Because that's the other way around. But I would have preferred to kind of use synthetic shutter, like rendering from these images. And we're releasing the data set, so anybody who wants to play around with it can just download it. And if you want to play without it, I can give it to you next week on a hard drive, because we have prepared it, yeah.
I ask, this is probably more qualified for the talk, but it's just because I'm quite ignorant about like how that could play. Because your field of experience is more like the film, and we're talking, expanding a bit on what Volker said about this feeling of how film feels, because we have a century of story and like legacy that, this is what films just feels. And I was curious if you have any experience on how these new technologies or advancements are being regarded in different media or different content like games, or even different platforms that we're not used to, like VR, which is a completely new thing.
Yeah, so for example, I experienced, there was this ACES framework, so there was a way to do color management in film, and they provided some transforms that had a filmic look, and that made a big splash in the gaming industry, because suddenly they had this like easy recipe to make a game look more filmic, and they all tried to implement this. So I have the feeling that games are getting more filmic, also like with depth of focus, with like the style, like the highlights that glow and so on. They more and more, in my personal feeling, go towards film. Yeah, I would really like to find more people who like to explore like really new looks beyond film. But it's tough. A lot of times you're always ending up like film doesn't render bright reds, but it makes them brownish and so on. There's a lot of transforms that even if you're starting from scratch, it is maybe because like the Kodak scientists and Fuji scientists and Agfa scientists, they didn't go there because of some limitations of material, but they designed the film stocks to be good for storytelling. But because I'm an engineer, because I'm excited about new technology, I hope that there are completely new looks that make sense for the story. But unfortunately, I haven't seen much in the last years. But hopefully we'll work on that all together.
If the goal of Netflix is to bring everything in HDR, why aren't they shooting in high frame rate then? What is the issue there?
Good question. Actually, Creative's pushing back, I would say, mostly. Yeah, so actually most of the gradings, for example, for Netflix are kind of moderate. So you could push high dynamic range much more, but then it would stutter.
Yeah.
And on Blu-rays, for example, often even the high dynamic range version is darker than the standard dynamic range version. So there was a big shitstorm on the internet about this, that because you typically grade the standard dynamic range version on a 100 nit monitor, but your home monitor displays it at 200 or 300 nit. But in HDR, the color pipeline is much better specified. So if you grade it at 100 nit, it gets displayed at 100 nit. So you graded it in the grading scene as, suite at about the same level, but then because your TV at home displays standard dynamic range brighter, people complained as soon as I turned to high dynamic range, suddenly the image get darker. And I was promised to have brighter images with HDR. And then the creative said, no, it's about these subtle blacks and so on. So that's often where consumers and creatives or storytellings crash, that the consumers have this expectation, everything gets vivid and bright, but that probably doesn't make sense for storytelling.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.